Just so you all know, Reverend Billy Graham was pro-choice. Also, the Southern Baptist Convention spoke out in favor of the Roe decision. I always think it's just interesting to go back historically and how quickly we forget what was true, 50 years ago.
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture.
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward
for inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. Missy and I are going to catch up, and then later on in the pod, Missy and I sat down with Reverend Katey Zeh. Katey is Chief Executive Officer for the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, and we have a really robust conversation about her work and the organization's work. Lots going on this week. It's going to be a good pod. It's going to be a heart-wrenching pod as well as we share a story in the opening segment. So stay tuned. Thanks for being with us. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well, and you?
I'm great.
Okay, really? Tell us about that.
Because as we are dropping this episode, you and I, with any luck, are sitting on Bourbon Street in a live music venue in New Orleans, enjoying a little mini vacation.
Absolutely. Hopefully, and when this drops, we're going to be in the Big Easy in NOLA.
That's right. We've been there, or I've been there one time.
Mm-hmm.
You and I guess 2 years ago, had a conference there.
Yep.
And we had one day to kill. Basically, conference was over and our flight wasn't until that evening.
Right.
So we ventured out to the French Quarter, right?
We went to the Quarter. We sure did. Well, we had to go visit Café du Monde for historical purposes. And, just across the street was the Quarter. So we went there. And then a couple of blocks away, Bourbon Street. So
we made friends with pirates.
We did.
We bought some ridiculous art that we had no business buying because we are not cool enough to hang this particular art in our home, but we still love the paintings. But then it started to rain, and so we ducked into, a venue with live music, of course. There's a few of those there. It just so happened to be Fritzl's. And we sat there and just spent the afternoon listening to this musician who was wonderful. And towards the end of his set, he was, kept asking for requests. And I was way too shy. I don't know if you remember this.
Oh, no, I remember it. And because there was only about 8 people in the restaurant.
Yeah, no, it was totally empty. But for whatever reason, I had a request, but I was embarrassed to ask. And you kept looking at me like, "Are you going to ask him?" I'm like, "No." So it got to be his last song, and I didn't ever ask him to play my request. But guess what?
He played it.
I didn't even have to request it. The Lord knew what song.
The rain clouds broke, the sun broke through, and Missy got her song.
I did. Shall we tell what it was? Because I'm almost embarrassed to admit it.
No, you have to tell it.
I wanted to hear him play I'll Fly Away.
Oh, yes, you did. One of your favorites.
It is. So he did. And you know what? It worked out well for him. He got a very good tip from me at the end. Anyways, it was fun. So I'm looking forward. Actually, I'm not looking forward. I am there and I'm having a great time.
That's exactly right.
That's what we're doing. Anyways.
Yeah, we're really looking forward, and hopefully when this drops, we will be there enjoying some jazz music, eating some beignets, also having some étouffée and a little boudin down at the Big Easy. So I'm looking forward to it. Hope we're having a great time.
I hope so too. So I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. Well, Missy, lots going on in the news this week. And unfortunately, one of the big stories around here, Oklahoma had to bury one of our children this week. And it was discovered a couple of weeks ago that a non-binary 16-year-old student by the name of Nex Benedict passed away. And news began to filter out pretty quickly that Nex was involved in an altercation at a Wasso public schools, and their high school was involved in a fight in the restroom there at the high school.
My understanding was that Nex was attacked in the restroom.
Yeah, I mean,
you know more about this story,
right?
Than
according
I do.
to reports that are coming out, and of course, the investigation. We do need to preface the investigation is still ongoing. The school system is working with local authorities there, but preliminary reports are that Nex was jumped and beaten by 3 individuals in the bathroom. The altercation didn't last very long. Other students and teachers intervened. Reports are coming out from not only school officials, but those who witnessed the event, that Nex and the other student who was involved in the altercation, plus the other 3 who were involved, walked out of the bathroom on their own accord, was sent to the principal's office. They were assessed by a registered nurse there on site. Everybody seemed at the time to be okay even after the altercation. It was suggested to Nex's parents that they be treated, possibly just a follow-up at a local hospital, but everything seemed to be okay. Well, unfortunately, they did go, but next day, Nex was rushed to the hospital, and they passed away pretty quickly afterwards. We don't know what the reason for the hospital visit was the next day. Reports came out earlier this week by the Owasso PD that after an autopsy was done, that Nex passed away not due to any kind of trauma associated with a physical fight that preceded this medical episode. So at the time we recorded this, we still have no idea the reason for Nex's death. But this has opened up a huge conversation here in Oklahoma, and it is based upon how Oklahoma legislatures, how Oklahoma public schools protect our LGBTQI plus students. Mm-hmm. And it has really caused a firestorm because...
Or rather, how we don't.
How we don't. That's exactly right. Because in the course of the interviews, trying to find out what happened on campus and the altercation and Nex's death, an interview that Nex's mother gave said that Nex had been bullied pretty frequently within the school system that year, and it in particularly increased after Oklahoma passed legislation after legislation, executive order after executive order that was anti-LGBTQI plus, and especially when our governor Kevin Stitt signed an executive order that outlawed DEI programs in public universities. That's when the bullying really ratcheted up. And so I wrote an article about it this week. I am infuriated that I live in a state that says they want to protect every student, but they continue to pass legislation and pass executive laws that are antithetical to that statement. And I'm just fed up with it. I'm brokenhearted for Nex and Nex's family, all the friends that are involved in this, but I've had enough. We cannot continue down this road. I don't know what to do besides continue to advocate and continue to beg people. If these elected officials and so-called leaders do not lead with compassion and reason, then it's time to get rid of them. We need to elect people who, they don't have to agree with me, as I said in my article this week, but they need to lead with compassion and reason, and our current leadership is not doing that.
I am trying to decide how much to... how angry to allow myself to get in this moment.
At this point, I just don't think that there's...
Yes, the first news broke was that Nex passed away as a result of the physical altercation in this building. And so, and it wasn't being widely reported. It wasn't getting the attention that it should have. Now, I believe some other major, national news outlets are reporting on this. And I feel like organizations, individuals who are advocates for, inclusion, love, compassion, all of these things that we stand for are trying to beat the drum of we're talking about lives. We're talking about life and death. We're talking about life and death. And I think I've probably said it before, but the thing is, if you have people in power who feel like there's only one definition of life that is of value, you're talking to a wall. Mm-hmm. Because if they're telling you there is one definition for the way that a human being is allowed to exist in this world, and if this person is deviating from that, they don't see the value in that life. So therefore, why would they be motivated to pass legislation or to encourage programs that are going to allow that person or, people on the fringes or however they define who's in and who's out are going to be able to thrive? How can you expect that of these people? And I guess, what you're getting at is true. We have to vote. We have to put people in power who do not see the world this way.
Right.
Who do not see people as strictly, cisgender, heteronormative, exactly that, or you have no value. That's how we've gotten here. Mm-hmm. And it's so frustrating because we can sit here and say, this is about life and death. For you and I, for our community, for the people that, we're around, that is absolutely true and worthy. It's just mind-boggling that in a state like ours, the people who are making decisions do not seem to care.
Exactly.
Because there's life that has value, and there's other. And in the meantime, parents are watching their children.
To be even more frank,
die.
It is more important for Governor Kevin Stitt and Superintendent Ryan Walters to own the libs than for one non-binary student to live. And I'm sorry to put it that bluntly, but and they would deny it to the hilt, but their actions suggest that. They are more concerned about their rhetoric, about their popularity, and about owning libs in this state than they are about that one student. And it upsets me. I'm infuriated by it because here's the reality. Even though Nex's death may not have been directly associated with the fight the previous day, we do know for a fact that Nex had been bullied time and time again. And for every Nex out there, there are 100 other students in the state of Oklahoma who are going through that exact same thing every day in this state. Mm-hmm. Every day. What is the governor? What is the superintendent? What is the state legislators doing to protect those children? They claim they're pro-life. I think it's a bunch of BS because what they're really more concerned about is their ideology and the fact that they makes them feel good to say these things and to show their supremacy and patriarchy and everything involved to control other people in this state. I've had enough.
So in the worst case of irony ever, you were telling me before we came on today about the law in Alabama, is it?
Yeah, the Supreme Court of Alabama ruled this week that an embryo is actually a child. And there has been all kinds of fallout from this ruling in Alabama, especially concerning IVF treatment, because now all of those embryos that are frozen for IVF are considered children. And almost immediately, the biggest healthcare center in Alabama has stopped IVF treatment because they don't know what is going to come next because of this ruling.
So I don't know the details of this law. All I knew is when you mentioned it, again, just getting so angry that this ilk of politicians view those cells as more valuable than our kids who are in school and facing what next faced. You can't make it make sense.
Right.
You just can't. And so that's my only comment about it. I don't know a whole lot about that law. I just know that it, unfortunately, I'm 0% surprised. But for this to kind of happen on the same week is just, it makes me ill. It
is. And again, and I go to my original statement that I made in kind of my diatribe regarding the next story. And I will also would say the same thing about this Alabama story. These individuals claim that they are pro-life. I call BS on that, because a consistent pro-life stance would make certain that our LGBTQI plus students and children and adults were not only protected, but had the same rights as everybody else in this country. In addition to that, a pro-life stance would make certain that mothers, expectant mothers, have the same rights and the same health care to help them prosper as an individual and live, as the Bible says, in abundance. And we're going to talk about that here a little bit in our interview. But I'm just so fed up with all of this. It is maddening. It seems like we're just continuing down this road of chaos. And I'm so glad that we've got a guest this week that is reasonable, compassionate, and reminds us of the humanity that's at stake when we talk about these very complex issues. So we sat down with Reverend Katey Zeh this week from the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, and it was just a wonderful conversation with her.
It really was, and again, our opening, conversation about next and about the law in Alabama kind of, unfortunately, lead nicely. And
certainly timely.
Timely is a better word. I wish this was not what we were talking about. I wish this was not what we were so angry about this week. But I'm really thankful that Katey was on this week in particular, because I think she's got an organization, a message, a book that is so desperately needed right now.
So stay tuned. Missy and I sit down with Reverend Katey Zeh from Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice.
I've always been struck by the scriptures we avoid reading, the stories we don't want to tell in church. I'm Brett Harris, and that's what You've Never Read This, a new series from God Knows Where, is all about. We'll read from prophets and histories we've hidden from ourselves, even words of wisdom and warning from Jesus that we've likely never heard. As with everything we do here, God knows where this will lead us, but I hope you'll join me. Find God Knows Where on your favorite podcast platform.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us. Reverend Katey Zeh is an ordained Baptist minister and the chief executive officer of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. The Center for American Progress named her one of their top justice-seeking faith leaders to watch, and she is a member of the Clergy Advocacy Board of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. She has written for many outlets, including the Washington Post, Sojourners, Religion News Services, Rewire, and Religion Dispatches, and she has been featured in numerous outlets, including The Atlantic, CNN, The Nation, BBC, NBC News, Newsweek, and Vice News. Reverend Katey is the co-host of Kindred's podcast and the author of 2 books, A Complicated Choice, Making Space for Grief and Healing in the Pro-Choice Movement, and Women Rise Up, Sacred Stories of Resistance for Today's Revolution. Katey, you're a busy minister. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here.
Well, Katey, let's begin with the organization that you lead, the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. Tell our listeners more about that organization and some of the work that you do.
Yes, I always love to talk about our history because I think it's one of the forgotten pieces that is so important, especially in the context that we're in now, this post-Roe reality. For people to know that in the years prior to Roe, there were many clergy and lay people who formed networks to get people access to safe abortion care from 1967 to 1973. And that was the clergy consultation service on abortion. And after the Roe decision, the denominations and religious communities that had been part of that very robust network decided that they needed to continue to enshrine those abortion rights at the state level, and created what was then the Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights. And then we changed our name in 1994 to the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. So we are 51 years old. In many ways, we are in a similar place to where those clergy were in the 60s and early 70s, and also in a different place. And I think we are constantly asking ourselves, in the moment that we're in, what is it that we can uniquely offer for folks who want to be involved in this work? And so, we have a number of programs, but we really like to, one, invest in the next generation of leaders. I actually got started in RCRC as a young person myself, and so I'm very passionate about being in conversation with the young activists who are already leading and will continue to lead this work. We also really focus on helping faith leaders articulate their own values around this. I think for so long, people have been reticent to speak out on these issues and now feel compelled to. So how do we help people deal with their own abortion stigma within themselves, and then find ways to talk about this within their faith values? And we also focus on patients and the people who care for them. So we provide resources to patients as they're making decisions, but also care for and provide support to abortion providers and their staffs who deal with so much hardship just in trying to do their jobs and caring for patients, especially now. So that's a little bit about who we are at RCRC.
As we were getting ready for this conversation today, and I was poking around on the website, planning to kind of ask, some of these questions, I was just so surprised at how robust it is. There's so much information and so many resources on there. I was so impressed. I would encourage anyone to go check out this website and all of the work that you do. It's amazing.
Like Katey said, it's an organization that's been around for 50 years, doing remarkable work, providing resources for individuals and for groups. Just really, really robust. We certainly want to encourage you to check out their website. In your mission statement, Katey, you say you're multi-faith, intersectional, and anti-racist. I love that emphasis within the purview of reproductive justice. Can you ferret that out a little bit for us, please?
Sure. So we talk about being inspired by reproductive justice values. And that is a specific frame that was created in the 90s by Native American women and Black women to really call the question around, was it enough to only focus on access to legal abortion when our reproductive lives require so much more than just that for us to truly flourish and thrive? And so as we think about our work, we know that obviously access to abortion care is extremely important and under threat, increasingly so every day. And for us to actually live in a world that we want to, where everybody can thrive fully, we have to do more than just focus on access to abortion care. We have to think about all of the things that impact our well-being. And so that's how we approach the work, is making sure that we're addressing all the systemic issues that get in the way of people actually being able to create and care for the families they desire. And that is our ultimate vision for the world. So we have to make sure that we're approaching the work that we do, knowing that it's about so much more than just abortion care.
Love that. Okay, so RCRC's tagline is pro-faith, pro-family, pro-choice. Now, Katey, I know this is no surprise to you, but you're a Baptist minister, and society is not used to hearing Baptists claim to be pro-faith, pro-family, and pro-choice.
Well, the first two they're okay
with. Well, yeah, the first two.
In their own definition.
Exactly. So as a Baptist minister, which I am a Baptist minister as well, what is your theological and practical reasoning behind being a strong advocate for reproductive care?
Well, I always like to clarify some misconceptions around this because, for one, Reverend Billy Graham was pro-choice around the Roe decision and was public about his support for Planned Parenthood. So that always surprises people.
I'm so glad you said that, because I often quote, believe it or not, W.A. Criswell from Dallas, Texas at First Baptist Church, who has a sermon who's advocating for pro-choice legislation. So I'm sorry, I digress, but go ahead.
No, it's okay. I think it's just important to dispel some of the mythology around this. And so many people know of Reverend Billy Graham. So I think he's a really important example of just kind of the political takeover that happens after the Roe decision. So just so you all know, Reverend Billy Graham was pro-choice. Also, the Southern Baptist Convention spoke out in favor of the Roe decision. So I am certainly not the first, and it will not be the last. So I always think it's just interesting to go back historically and how quickly we forget what was true, 50 years ago. For me, I have never felt tension around this. And I think it's because of how I got involved in the work. And for me, it was while I was a seminary student, I had done some training with RCRC, the organization I lead now, around how to journey with people who are making decisions about a pregnancy. And through that and my desire to use the skills I learned, I ended up volunteering at a clinic that provided abortion care just down the street from Yale Divinity School, where I was a student. And it was really profound. For one, to experience what it felt like to be perceived as an abortion patient walking into the doors of the clinic and to be harassed by Christian people was really impactful on me, to feel what that felt like and to have a lot of compassion for the people who had to deal with that every day, who were there to get health care or who were there to do their jobs. So that was very impactful. But even more so, I ended up volunteering in the procedure room with patients, holding their hands through their procedure. And it was just so transformative. One, to see the compassionate, kind care that the providers were giving the patients, but also to be able to hold presence with people in that moment at such a vulnerable, transformative moment. I just felt like this is why I went to seminary. I mean, it's to be in spaces like that. I mean, what is more sacred than being able to break the isolation of a moment like that? And for me, there was just, I couldn't imagine doing anything more Christ-like than that just to me resonated with something that was so missing, were people being able to like actually stand and hold presence with people throughout that time. So for me, it all comes down to those experiences that I had with patients in the room and feeling a call, like a really specific call to do this work, to be a loving presence in the midst of so much vitriol outside of the clinic. And so, people want to argue about this. And for me, there's really no argument to be made because of the experiences that I had with patients. I know that there's so much work that needs to be done, healing work that needs to be done because of the damage that faith communities have done for people around their reproductive lives, that I could spend the rest of my life just doing that work and would never run out of things to do.
Right. That's one of the things, and I know Miss is going to ask you about the book here in just a second, but one of the things I really appreciated about the book that you wrote is that when you're talking about your theological reflection on this issue, oftentimes we get so siloed into a conversation about reproductive health. And we just want texts that deal with that particular issue. But what you beautifully did in the book and within the organization is to bring in other theological concepts, such as a theology of compassion or a theology of living abundantly, as you suggest in the book. And those two need to be part of this conversation as we develop a theological framework in how to react and relate to people who are considering reproductive abortion care. And so I love that part of the mission of the organization, of RCRC, as well as the book that Missy's going to now ask you about.
Yeah, kind of stepping on my
Sorry, I apologize. I got ahead of myself.
Okay. So let's talk about the book you recently wrote called A Complicated Choice. Again, as Mitch said, it's fantastic. It's a challenging, beautiful collection of stories about people who've had to make, a complicated choice. So I wondered if you would tell us a little bit about the book, how you came up with this project, and what kind of telling these stories meant to you.
I always like to be confessional about this because the book that I wrote is not the book that I pitched. And I think it for several reasons. So the book that I pitched was broader in terms of reproductive loss and the grief that comes with reproductive loss in all forms. And I wanted abortion to be part of that because I knew from my experiences that some people did feel grief after an abortion, just as they would after a miscarriage or infertility or in vitro not working, or, it just, I wanted to normalize it within this reproductive loss framework. But after I submitted my proposal, the publisher came back and said, actually, we really want you to write the whole book about this, about abortion.
Yeah.
And I think I was scared to pitch that.
Sure,
I mean, I didn't really want to write a whole book about abortion. I already get so much pushback in my public work and have, found myself on all kinds of anti-abortion sites. And it can be honestly a little scary sometimes to be targeted. And so I didn't want to make that target bigger by publishing a book about abortion. However, I think it was the book that the world needed. And I didn't know at the time, we knew that the overturn of Roe was inevitable, but did not know when that was going to happen or what Supreme Court case it would be. And my book came out just a couple of months before the leaked draft came out in May of 2022. And so I just feel really grateful now for Spirit's guidance, honestly, to have written that book when I did, because I think so many people were asking, how did we get here and what do we do? And I felt like I had just spent several years really thinking about those questions and had something tactile to offer, especially in these times. So that's how I came up with the project. For it to be storytelling specifically, I'm not someone who has experienced abortion in my life. And so I knew if I was going to write about abortion, it had to be rooted in the lived experiences of people who had that experience. And so I knew that needed to be at the very center. There's very little of me in this book, to be honest. I mean, there are some of my thoughts and experiences that I've had, but it is primarily about the people who were brave and vulnerable enough to share their stories with me and to allow me to bring them, into the world, into a public conversation. And I knew that the most important thing was to get their stories right. And I felt like as soon as I knew that the people I included were pleased with how their stories had been told, I knew that was all I really needed to hear, because that was the most important part of the book.
Yeah.
Well, you told them beautifully. And as I was reading this book, I found a personal connection, and I'm going to confess, I'm so mortified and embarrassed. However, I too have written about abortion. We've talked about this before.
I apologize up front.
I know. I'm confessing.
Katey, what you don't know about my co-host here and partner in life is that growing up, she grew up in Texas, a wonderful Southern Baptist fundamentalist. So let me introduce you to Missy the fundamentalist now.
Yes, once upon a time. So one of my high school research papers was written about post-abortion syndrome. And you write about this and tell the background of this, and I wanted to crawl in a hole. I was like cringing for that teenage self that and I guess, again, growing up where I did, I found no shortage of books in my library that talked about this. But you talk about David Reardon and the fact that this is actually not a thing. So I just thought that was a really interesting connection. I'm so glad you mentioned it, but it did. I'm just cringing now thinking about that paper. I wish I had it, just to look back at how ridiculous it was, and I wish I could go back to my English teacher and say, I'm sorry you had to read that.
Well, could we talk about this just in case people don't know?
Yes, please do.
That's what I was going to ask you. Yes, please talk about this.
Yeah. Well, and for one, I hope you can have compassion for your younger self. I mean, I think I grew up in a very evangelical church myself. I don't know that I would have written a paper about post-abortion syndrome, but I certainly had views that make me cringe now. And my goodness, if you don't have views that make you cringe from when you were younger,
right,
you need to be doing some work, because
I love that.
You haven't done enough growth and evolution in your life if you don't look back at your teenage self.
There's a lot of things we laugh about that we wrote about in our younger days.
Lot.
But that is one that we have brought up on the show before. So when I saw that book, I wanted you to address that, because there may be some other kids out there seeing these articles in these libraries that are now really restrictive about this. So talk to us about this.
So I don't know if I've talked about David Reardon on a podcast, but basically he has personally invested so much time and energy into propagating this idea that post-abortion syndrome is an actual psychological diagnosis, which it is not. And he didn't coin the phrase. I believe crisis pregnancy centers in the 60s and 70s came up with it, but then he kind of took the idea and ran with it, and has created so much research, I put that in quotes, that it does seem like it's a real thing. And I think when a myth gets repeated over and over and over again, people do just assume that it's the truth. And that's certainly the case around this idea of post-abortion syndrome. So the idea is that basically abortion causes psychological damage to people, and like directly. Mm-hmm. And it's been disproven. There's a great book that I talk about in the book called The Turnaway Study that followed people, both people who had been turned away from abortion care and people who received abortion care, and what their emotional journeys were like over 10 years. So very scientifically done. And what they found was people who were denied abortion care, they immediately experienced more distress than the people who were able to access it, which makes sense in a lot of ways. And that the primary emotion people feel after abortion is relief. It's not the only one, but that's the primary one. And that after about 5 years, both of those groups had pretty much resolved whatever feelings they had about it and were able to move forward in their lives. So whether or not they had to continue a pregnancy and make a decision about that, or had received abortion care and had whatever feelings they did, after 5 years, they'd pretty much integrated all of it, into their lives, just like we do about many difficult things in our lives. So, but people have used this idea that like abortion hurts women, and I say women specifically because that's the language that they use. But it's just not factually true that it causes distress. If anything, there are usually presenting issues ahead of time, or the circumstances that led a person to be in a place of needing an abortion that actually are the cause of whatever mental distress they might have. It's not directly the cause. So I think it's just important to name that for people who might be dealing with their own like abortion stigma or ideas about abortion, that it's harmful to people psychologically, and it's just not true.
Well, my apologies.
Is that why you're walking around last night just all depressed and everything?
Maybe so. But I thought you did a great job in speaking about that in the totality of the book. It's really easy, like somebody who wants to say there's this thing, post-abortion syndrome, because you're clearly depressed, and we're not, like you said, what are the other factors involved that leads somebody to that place and space, and let's address those and own them. And one of the very real factors in the worlds that we, were immersed in was the fear of how you were now going to be responded to, and if you were going to be accepted back into your community, the secrecy behind it, all of these other things that if that was something that weighed on you, that, okay, yeah, that's going to cause you some stress, but it's not necessarily just that the abortion, it's all these other external factors.
Right.
So I thought the
isolation,
yes,
especially, I think is one that pretty much everybody in the book talked about, was feeling isolated, even if they felt supported by their partners, families. Everybody talks about their abortion experience as really isolating, which definitely contributes to feelings of depression or anxiety.
Absolutely. So I appreciated that. Thank you.
I appreciate you confessing. And I hope, like I said, you'll cut yourself some slack. Don't bring that evangelical shame forward into your adult life. You got to reject that too, along with this
Katey, you have no idea.
Nonsense.
She just lives in a state of shame and guilt.
I know. I've been there too. I know. It's hard to let that stuff go.
So, Katey, speaking of stigma, there's this one phrase that you penned in the preface that really spoke to me because, we're involved and engaged in public dialogue a lot. But I love how you captured this in the book. You wrote, "I am no longer interested in circular conversations regarding the moral absolutes of abortion. What I am fully invested in is working to dismantle abortion's stigma within myself, in the church, and in the world so that we can start showing up fully and lovingly for people in our communities who have abortions." I thought that was challenging to me, as well as beautifully inspired to motivate me to get out and just to love people and to care for them and show compassion for them. And always remember, there is a human side to this debate. Oftentimes we just get wrapped up in the debate. And I thought you penned that so beautifully. So, as well as post-abortion syndrome, what are some other stigmas that RCRC and yourself look to dismantle or diffuse in society?
Mm-hmm. I think because of the pervasiveness of the rhetoric of the anti-abortion movement being what it is, we have all, and I mean everybody, have absorbed the idea that abortion there's an ick factor. We don't like thinking about it. We think it's something to be avoided. It's, some people will say, nobody wants to have an abortion, right? There's a lot of judgment that abortion is this thing that we really don't like to talk about, even if we, in theory, support people getting access to it. We don't really want to see it. We don't really want to think about it. We don't really want to hear about it. We would prefer to just have it compartmentalized and not think about. And so that's what I mean about abortion stigma, is just this idea that like at the root, it's wrong. There's something bad about it. And that, for some people, I'm not saying everybody has a great abortion experience. And I think I talk about abortion as a blessing, which people find very unsettling because it's so antithetical to what we hear from the anti-abortion side. And what I mean by that is that for the people I've talked to who feel like abortion was a blessing in their lives, they see it as this turning point, often making a decision for themselves that then catalyzed some new era of their lives where they're like, now I have to make meaning of this. I made this decision. Now, what am I going to do differently? For some people, it, preserved their health for one, it saved their lives. But in other cases, it allowed them to leave abusive relationships. They would have been tied to this person forever had they continued the pregnancy, and having the abortion gave them the strength that they needed, the opportunity to leave and to create a new life. Young people who wanted to finish school and had dreams that would have been totally derailed by becoming a parent before they were ready. That's what I mean by abortion as a blessing. It's not that it's easy, but that the ability to make that decision can be so incredibly powerful for people. It can save their lives. It can bless them. It can lead to that total human flourishing that I was talking about. And so I really challenge people to think about, what about that statement, abortion is a blessing, makes you uncomfortable, and to think through your own values around it. And again, I just think it's like working through internalized sexism and racism and heterosexism. It's just part of the air that we breathe because of the way the anti-abortion movement has been so pervasive with this messaging, that we've all absorbed it to a degree. And it's not our fault. We don't have to feel shame about it. Missy, you can take this shame part off. But it is our responsibility to interrogate it and ask where it came from and what function does it serve, right? When we're silent and silenced about something, that serves a purpose that might not actually be it might not be self-serving to be silent about it. I think it's what allows the myths to be perpetuated by not hearing the stories, by not talking about our reproductive and sexual lives. So that's a little bit about what I mean about the mythology. And another one that I always like to share with people is that for the majority of people who receive abortion care, they are already parents. The majority are already parents. And so oftentimes the decision to have an abortion is a parenting decision. It is a decision to care for the children that they already have, knowing that they don't have the capacity to do that with another. And so for them, it is a very loving decision that they are making for the family that they've already created. And I think that that's the myth of who has abortions. One of them is this idea that, there are people who, like just young people who are being careless and not thinking about the ramifications of their actions. I'm not saying that isn't true, but for the majority, these are parents making a parenting decision for the family they have.
Katey, that's demythologizing of the rhetoric, I think, has been on display over the last year or so, ever since the Dobbs decision was rendered. We have seen, and I have to admit, surprisingly pieces of legislation adopted in states like Kansas that have been pro-choice in nature. And it seems as though there is now a groundswell across the country, even in deep red states, that says, this is something that needs to be canonized in our legislation because of the demythologizing of this issue. There's very personal stories, as you have told in your book. And we're hearing even in states that passed really draconian laws prohibiting abortion, some of those legislators are saying, well, I didn't realize it did that, as women are coming forward and saying, I was having a difficult pregnancy and I almost lost my life because I couldn't get an abortion in this state. We're seeing it in states like Texas and Oklahoma, where we live, and Ohio. Are you even surprised about where the country is in its whole? Because if you were to believe the rhetoric, you would think all of these, these church-going folks in these red states are pro or anti-abortion, I should say. It doesn't seem that's the case. Are you surprised by the groundswell that's happening in the country right now?
I'm not surprised, because even just statistically, we know that the majority of voters support legal access to abortion. And that was true before the overturn of Roe. It's true among people of faith, too. And I think that's another myth to dispel, is conflating religious people with being anti-abortion. That is just statistically not true. You can go on the Pew Research Center and they will show you that. It's true among some religious groups, but the majority is simply not the case. And so what we're seeing politically is not in alignment with what voters actually want. And I think that that's why it's important to talk about white Christian nationalism, having used the anti-abortion platform as a way to amass power so that they can control elections and people's votes. And that's why we are here. It's not because they reflect the majority of people. It's because they've been able to amass power by manipulating voters with an anti-abortion message, and to amass that power over time and to build alliances across different conservative political groups that don't necessarily hold their long-term vision. It's
sure.
Because the political agenda of white Christian nationalism goes far beyond even where we are now.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really important for people to understand. If you look at the documents from the 80s and what they were trying to create, they're not going to stop here. But it doesn't surprise me that the backlash, because making abortion illegal is not what the majority of voters wanted.
Right.
And I think really seeing it's so devastating to me that what it requires is for pregnant people to be on the brink of death for people to start listening to pregnant people. Yes. And also, we know this historically, what this looks like, and we know globally what it looks like to have no access to abortion care. We didn't have to recreate that. We have created unnecessary suffering for people. That's devastating. And I find that just completely reprehensible and immoral, and it's on all of us to fix it. So I'm glad to at least see at some state levels that people, when it comes down to it, voters they're not in favor of having abortion inaccessible. Mm-hmm. They want people to have it because they understand its importance, and I think people are seeing that on a new level. And I also think that access to abortion care before the fall of Roe was already difficult. I don't think people realize just how difficult for many people it was to get access to abortion care in many states in the Midwest and in the South. Yeah. They thought Roe was enough. They thought Roe, we have Roe versus Wade. Well, it was never supposed to be the ceiling. It was always the floor, and it never guaranteed everybody who needed access to abortion care could get it. And so I think it's just been a huge wake-up call for people to really see what it means to deny people access to life-saving reproductive health care and what that means. And so it's going to take us a while to get out of where we are, but I'm glad to see the progress that's being made. And I just hope it continues.
Yeah. Well, Reverend Katey Zeh, thank you so much for being a guest this week on Good Faith Weekly. Reverend Zeh is the Chief Executive Officer at the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. You can find out more about their organization at rcrc.org, and you can pick up her latest book, A Complicated Choice, Making Space for Grief and Healing in the Pro-Choice Movement, at wherever you purchase your reading materials. Well, Katey, thank you so much for being a guest this week. But before we let you go, we've got to ask you one last question. So, Missy, take it away.
So, Katey, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So, in light of our conversation today and the work that you do, what is your more to tell?
Yes. Well, I recognize that having conversations like this can be, difficult for people who maybe have experienced abortion in their own lives. Maybe it was a long time ago, maybe it was recently. And so I want to make sure that people have access to the resources that they might need spiritually to work through the feelings that might be coming up. Or if you're someone who knows somebody who's going through this and you're not sure where to send them, we have another resource called Abortion's Welcome. It's abortionswelcome.org. We created this before the fall of Roe with our partners, Faith in Women in Mississippi, and it is a spiritual companion site for people before, during, and after abortion care, and also has accurate medical and legal resources too. But it's primarily about providing those pro-choice spiritual resources that you really can't find anywhere else, as people might need, a ritual or a prayer or a reading or a meditation. It's full of all of those resources. So just visit abortionswelcome.org, and I hope it'll be a resource that you can use yourself or share with someone you know.
Excellent. Katey, thank you so much. We really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Missy, wow. I mean, Katey was just really amazing.
She is amazing. Her organization is unbelievable. As I said in the beginning of the interview, that website, doing research, popped on to kind of pull a few things. I couldn't even begin to just pull a few things out. There's so many resources there, so much great information. Absolutely. People, just bookmark it in your mind. And if you know somebody ever who needs help, who needs advice, who needs resources, direction, this is a phenomenal organization.
And this has been one of really, I guess, the surprising, and it shouldn't have been, and shame on me for even saying this, but it has been a surprise for me. After the fall of Roe, doing my research, trying as a minister, trying to do a deep dive into abortion care, reproductive justice, I have come across all these organizations that have been around for decades, and I'd never heard of them. And one of them is Katey's organization, RCCC, or RCRC, that's doing amazing work. And so I'm angry a little bit, to be honest with you. I'm disappointed as well that I haven't known about these organizations that are doing such stellar work.
I mean, there's so much to be embarrassed about. I will say that when you learned of this organization and reached out to interview Katey, that is when you then found out about her book,
right?
Which we read. And I just want to talk a little bit. I think I want to share, but I don't know. We're going to see how this goes.
Okay.
So in the opening foreword, which was written by Alexis McGill Johnson, the president and CEO of Planned Parenthood. One of the lines that Alexis says is, "Stigma is one of the most powerful tools of oppression."
Yeah.
And then later on in the preface that Katey writes, she has a statement that says, "Thanks to a whole host of unearned privileges, including affordable health care, economic resources, and a bit of good luck," I have that double highlighted, "I have not been in the position of making a difficult decision about a pregnancy, but I easily could have been." And as I read this book, as I read these stories, and as I confessed, in our interview about my high school English research project about post-traumatic abortion syndrome, which is not really a thing, I really started to organize some things and some thoughts I had and have, and just thought it might be interesting to confess as a means of talking about the bigger issue. I chose to write my paper in high school on this anti-abortion, persuasive essay because I knew it would be easy. I mean, this will be no surprise to you. I tend to take the path of least resistance, and I thought, what am I going to write about? I'll write about abortion. And at the time, I really did buy into,
Sure,
abortion is wrong, it's sinful, you shouldn't do it.
And I have to interject here because I don't want our audience to think you're the only fundamentalist on this show, or former fundamentalist on the show, because I was right there with you growing up. I held all these beliefs too. So right,
but I mean, and I'm kind of going in a little bit of a different direction with this. So yes, I wrote this paper believing what I wrote, but also because it took little effort. Mm-hmm. I was able to find information, write about it, be angry about it or whatever.
Sure.
All the while knowing if I found myself in a position as a teenager in which I was pregnant, I would have gone after an abortion.
Wow.
And I knew it. Mm-hmm. And it brings me back to that statement that cuts so deep, that stigma is one of the most powerful tools of oppression. And then when Katey said, thanks to a whole host of unearned privileges, including affordable healthcare, economic resources, and a bit of good luck, I have not been in the position of making a difficult decision about a pregnancy. And I remember really thinking that and knowing what my choice would be, not because I didn't want a baby. I've always been baby crazy, but because I wouldn't have been able to live with the stigma in my community of having fallen into, teen motherhood.
Right.
And there's so much I think we could talk about here if you want to, if this is a worthy subject. But what Katey talks about in the book is that people who have abortions, oftentimes those negative emotions are associated with, again, the situations that led them to having to make that decision, but also the loss of community, the isolation, or the secrecy that has to be there for these women. And when I'm telling you, I am coming to you as a white, woman of privilege who, what I had been taught was so messed up that I felt like I had to outwardly judge everyone else for doing this thing because that was wrong. All the while knowing if I needed to access that, I would, because I would rather do that than face the embarrassment in my community. Mm-hmm. I don't know what to do with that, but it's been eating at me all week. Mm-hmm. It doesn't even touch on all of the things that Katey talked about, the systemic injustices and people who are already raising families who make this choice as the most loving, choice for their family.
Right.
And so as the religious right is railing against this, enemy, they call it, of abortion and creating this narrative, that's what we are doing. That's how we are messing with the minds of young people and adults, to think that way.
Yeah.
And so imagine in my position of privilege, if that was my mindset, how much more is that stigma affecting people who don't have privilege, who don't have access? So I don't know.
No, first of all, thank you so much for being honest about that, because I think, you very genuinely vocalized a reality in our world that for people of privilege, it's easy to rail against some of these issues because it doesn't necessarily cost them anything. Because of their privilege, they may never have to face this choice in their life. Right. And therefore, they can take this position knowing full well that if they had to make that decision, it most likely would be possibly entertaining an abortion. They may also entertain the possibility of having that child. That's the whole idea of pro-choice. But they know in the back of their mind it would be a consideration. All the while they're railing against this and making it so black and white in their argumentation. All of that rhetoric, again, as you said, filters down to people who do not have the means, do not have access to medical care, do not have the ability to seek the care that they might need. And that stigma is just so heavy upon them. And I think what you just said is actually more common than any of us will ever realize.
I think so. And it had been a long time since I had kind of faced that decision or that time in my life. I don't know if it was this way for you, but I just remember in high school, that was always the thing is, who is pregnant? You know, there was always a couple in your class, you know, that, you know, turned up pregnant. And then it was always just, it was weird. So it was in, I don't know, it was just in my face all the time. So it was something I think every teenage, at least girl, I don't know about guys, was forced to think about. And what would you do in that situation? I had a friend that got pregnant. And it was very much a thing of what's she going to do? And I remember thinking, what would I do? And then that's when it came to the point of, yeah, I would seek out abortion care because I would have been mortified. I felt like I would have been ostracized. Yeah. And so I think what we know is that abortion care will always be available to a certain subset of people.
Absolutely.
Period. So when you're telling me you're stripping away this care and making it illegal, you are targeting groups of people intentionally. And that there's no way to get around that. You can't sugarcoat that. You can't say, oh, it's about all life. No, it's about control. It's about oppression. It's about racism. It's just all of those things.
And I'm so glad you brought this up because as you were talking and, you know, just really outlining this for us, I thought to myself, you know what? While this is the case right now, this has been historically true. Because what happened 200 years ago, or even 100 years ago, when a young unwed female found themselves pregnant, what did the wealthy family do?
They sent her away.
And
because it brought shame upon the family.
Right. And the child may have been raised, you know, in another part of the family, but not because it was the stigma of shame. But if you didn't have those means,
right,
you ended up pregnant and then ostracized by your community.
Yeah.
And so the economic realities have always been there, and we're seeing that play out even today. But it goes back to what you just said. It's the stigma of shame in both cases.
But supremacy wants to keep it that way. Yeah. And white supremacy wants to keep it that way. Yeah. And that's what, because again, and I want to be clear about this, I had a family that as we would have said, you know, back in the day, gotten in trouble, you know, that would have loved me. You know, I wouldn't have been ostracized from my family, but just that stigma, that idea was so powerful that's what, from my place of privilege, would have done. And it just, it wrecks me to think about that. And to kind of parse that out. I think Katey did a great job. She talks also about when she started going to the clinic to volunteer with women seeking abortion care. And she talks about walking through the protesters and they were yelling at her, you know, don't kill your baby and all these awful things. And she said, she talked about feeling the urge to turn around and saying, but I'm not even pregnant.
Right.
And she said, and when she said that and she unpacked that, she said, I need to figure out why I feel the need to disclaim that. Yeah, and that's when she wrote that paragraph, I thought, I need to figure out why I felt the need to have a different standard for myself, you know, back in the day than I would have thought today. Yeah. So anyways, it was really interesting. Again, she tells stories of women that are fascinating, but I also really enjoyed how she wove in kind of her thoughts and her process. And one of the things that she said in the book that I think I will just carry with me forever is resist simple answers to life's complex questions. And I think that's absolutely, I mean, a good point to go by in anything.
Absolutely.
It is complex. It's not as easy as, you know, some would like to have it be.
It never is. So, but I am so thankful that there are ministers out there like Katey Zeh, organizations like RCRA, RC that are doing this work. And I just want to encourage anybody out there who is faced with having to make a decision about abortion care, or know of someone who is facing a decision about abortion care, that there are resources for them that talk about this from a faith perspective, that talk about this from a practical perspective, and that they are not going to be judged, but they're going to be loved, they're going to be cared for, and they're going to be informed to make a decision that is best for them. And so please go check out their website, get Katey's book. It is just fabulous.
I agree.
Well, we'll be back next week after we get back from New Orleans, and we'll be rested and refreshed and ready for another great episode.
Absolutely. See you next week.
You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.